Welcome to the Soul Love Stories channel. This channel will bring you powerful love stories between Korean men and Black women, filled with passion, tension, forbidden attraction, tender moments, and even dark sides. Enjoy listening. Please subscribe to the channel to hear more great stories. I was the only Black woman who refused $10 million from a Mafia king, and that was the exact moment he decided to buy an entire war just to give me back my sight. I still remember the way the dust hung in the air that day, thick and metallic, like the battlefield itself was breathing down my neck. I was kneeling beside a boy who could not have been older than 12, my hands shaking as I tried to stop the bleeding with gauze that had already soaked through twice. My vision blurred at the edges again. That familiar dark halo closing in like a warning I could not outrun. It had been weeks since the explosion, weeks since the shrapnel tore through the left side of my world and left everything fractured, dim, unreliable. I learned to work through it. I had to. People here did not get the luxury of waiting for perfect vision. That was when he appeared. Not loudly, not dramatically, just there, standing behind the chaos like he did not belong to it, yet somehow controlled it. Kwon Dae-hyun did not wear a uniform, but everyone moved when he stepped forward. Even the armed men who had been shouting orders seconds earlier fell silent, their eyes flicking toward him with something that looked a lot like fear. I did not look up right away. I finished tying the bandage, pressed my palm against the boy's chest until I felt his breathing stabilize, then I stood. The world tilted slightly, just enough to remind me I was not whole anymore. "You need treatment," he said. His voice was low, controlled, the kind that did not need to be raised to be obeyed. "I am working," I replied. My tone came out sharper than I intended, but I did not care. I had learned quickly that men with power expected gratitude. I did not have any left to give. He studied me for a moment, his gaze precise, calculating like he was assessing damage on a battlefield rather than looking at a person. $10 million, he said. "You leave tonight. Private transport. Best surgeons in the United States." For a second, the world went quiet. 10 million. Enough to disappear. Enough to rebuild a life somewhere far away from the smell of blood and burning metal. Enough to see again, maybe. I felt the weight of it press against my chest, tempting, dangerous. Then I shook my head. "I am not something you can fix with money." There it was. The line that changed everything. I saw it in his eyes, not anger, not offense, something colder. Something that settled deep, like a decision locking into place. Around us, the noise of the camp returned, voices shouting, engines roaring, distant gunfire cracking through the air. But between us, there was only silence. He did not argue. He did not try to persuade me again. He just nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if he had just accepted terms in a negotiation no one else could hear. And that was the moment I should have been afraid. Because men like him do not walk away from refusal. They rewrite the world until refusal stops existing. The next time I saw Kwon Dae-hyun, the air felt different. Not quieter. Not safer. Just heavier. Like something invisible had shifted beneath the surface of everything I thought I understood. It started with the shipments. Supplies that were supposed to arrive every 3 days began showing up late. Then early, then not at all. Boxes marked as antibiotics turned out to be empty. Crates labeled surgical equipment arrived filled with outdated tools that should have been scrapped years ago. First, we blamed the usual chaos. War did that. It broke systems, blurred lines, made even the most basic logistics unreliable. But this was not random. It had a pattern, and patterns meant control. I noticed it when a convoy arrived at dawn, engines still humming, the drivers too nervous to make eye contact. I climbed into the back of one of the trucks, my fingers brushing over sealed containers that did not match the manifest. When I pried one open, expecting gauze or saline, I found advanced imaging equipment, still wrapped in protective casing, far too expensive and precise for a field clinic like ours. My heart started to pound, not from hope but from suspicion. Someone had rerouted this. Someone had decided that this place, this broken strip of land surrounded by conflict, suddenly mattered. "You should not be touching that." His voice cut through the morning like a blade. I turned slowly, already knowing who I would see. He stood at the edge of the truck, one hand resting casually against the metal frame, as if this entire operation existed simply because he allowed it to. "Why is this here?" I asked, ignoring his tone. "For you." The words landed harder than I expected. I felt my jaw tighten. People are dying because we do not have basic supplies, and you are sending machines we cannot even power properly. "They will be powered," he said calmly. "Everything you need will be here." "That is not the point." My voice rose before I could stop it. "You do not get to decide what this place needs based on me." His expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "I decide what moves through this region. That includes what reaches you." That was the moment it clicked. Not just influence, not just connections, control. He was not reacting to the war. He was shaping it. Every delayed shipment, every redirected supply line, every missing crate, it all traced back to one source. Him. The realization made my stomach twist. The realization made my stomach twist. "What did you do?" He did not answer directly. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence swallowing the small space between us. "There is a clinic," he said. "The only one capable of restoring your sight. It is currently under restricted operation." Restricted by who? He held my gaze for a second too long. "By people who profit from this war continuing exactly as it is." Restricted by who? He held my gaze for a second too long. "By people who profit from this war continuing exactly as it is." I let out a bitter laugh. "So your solution is to become one of them?" "No," he said quietly. "My solution is to remove them." It sounded simple when he said it, like erasing a name from a list. But nothing about this was simple. I had seen what happened when power shifted hands in places like this. It never came without a cost. And that cost was always paid in lives. Over the next few days, the changes became impossible to ignore. Checkpoints that used to delay us for hours suddenly waved our vehicles through without inspection. Armed groups that controlled certain routes disappeared overnight, replaced by others who operated with unsettling efficiency. Entire sections of the supply chain seemed to realign, bending toward a single outcome I could not yet fully see, but could feel pressing closer with every passing hour. Then came the blackout. One night, the entire region lost power. Not just us. Everything. The camp, the nearby town, even the distant military outposts that usually glowed faintly on the horizon. For 6 hours, the world was reduced to darkness and the sound of distant engines moving where no one could see them. I stood outside the clinic, my partial vision struggling to adjust, listening to the low rumble of something massive shifting in the distance. When the power returned, 3 new transport units were parked behind our facility, filled with equipment we had never requested, but suddenly could not function without. "You are moving pieces on a board," I said when I found him again. "And you are the reason the board exists," he replied. That answer should have angered me more than it did. Instead, it unsettled me, because part of me understood what he was doing. Not the scale of it, not the consequences, but the intent. He was not trying to buy me anymore. He was trying to remove every barrier that made my refusal possible. I learned more than I wanted to. The clinic he mentioned was not just advanced. It was controlled, funded through layers of contracts tied to military interests, protected by policies that prioritize certain patients over others based on value, influence, and strategic importance. People like me did not make the list. Not unless someone rewrote the rules. "You are risking everything for someone you barely know," I told him one evening, my voice quieter now, more tired than angry. He looked at me like the answer was obvious. "You are the only one who said no. That does not make me worth this. It makes you the only variable I cannot control," he said. I should have walked away then. I should have refused again, drawn a line so clear even someone like him could not cross it. But the truth was, the line had already been crossed. Not by me. By him. By the moment he decided that the world itself was negotiable. He was not doing this out of impulse. He was planning, calculating, restructuring entire systems with the patience of someone who had done this before. The shipments, the reroutes, the silent takeovers of supply chains, it was all leading somewhere. A single point, a single facility, a single decision. And whether I wanted it or not, everything was beginning to converge around me. The first time I understood what he had truly done, it was not through a report or a confession. It was through silence. Entire routes that used to echo with gunfire went quiet, not because peace had arrived, but because something far more controlled had replaced chaos. Armed convoys no longer clashed at random. They moved with intention, like pieces guided by a hand no one could see. And somehow every movement pointed toward the same outcome, the same narrow corridor that led to the clinic he had mentioned. I stood at the edge of the compound one evening, the horizon glowing faintly with distant fires, and realized this was no longer a war I recognized. It had become structured, directed, bought. "You changed the flow," I said when I found him again. My voice felt different now, less defiant, more accusatory. "This is not random anymore." He did not deny it. He never did. "Random is inefficient." "That is not what I meant." I stepped closer, my vision flickering at the edges, forcing me to focus harder on his silhouette. "People are dying along those routes. Entire villages are being cut off so your shipments can pass cleanly." "That is not what I meant." I stepped closer, my vision flickering at the edges, forcing me to focus harder on his silhouette. "People are dying along those routes. Entire villages are being cut off so your shipments can pass cleanly." "People were dying before I touched anything," he replied, his tone even, almost indifferent. "The difference is now it leads somewhere." The calm in his voice unsettled me more than anger ever could. "Leads where?" "To me. To a solution." The word felt hollow. There was nothing clean about what I was seeing. Reports started coming in from other clinics, from aid workers who sounded more confused than afraid. Certain areas were suddenly receiving surplus supplies they had never had access to before, while others were being systematically starved. It was not destruction for the sake of power. It was redistribution. Calculated. Precise. Like someone had mapped the entire region and decided which pieces were expendable. Then I heard the rumors. Two opposing factions, groups that had been locked in conflict for years, were suddenly receiving funding from unknown sources. Their equipment upgraded. Their movements synchronized in ways that should have been impossible. They were not fighting harder. They were fighting smarter. And in between their controlled clashes, corridors opened. Clean, untouched pathways where transport could move without interference. Pathways that led directly to one place. The clinic. "You are feeding both sides," I said when the realization finally settled into something solid and undeniable. "You are keeping this war alive." "I am controlling it," he corrected. "That is worse." He looked at me then, really looked like he was measuring whether I understood the scale of what I was accusing him of. "Uncontrolled war destroys everything," he said. "Controlled war creates access." I felt something inside me snap. Access built on bodies is not something you get to justify. His expression did not change, but there was a pause, a fraction of a second where something unspoken moved behind his eyes. "You think I created this system," he said quietly. "I did not. I learned how to use it." The honesty hit harder than any lie could have. He was not pretending to be a savior. He was not dressing this up as something noble. He was telling me exactly what he was, and somehow that made it worse, because it meant every choice he made was deliberate. Days passed and the pressure built. The clinic became more than a destination. It became inevitable. Every supply route, every redirected convoy, every controlled conflict fed into its operation. Equipment arrived ahead of schedule. Specialists were quietly transferred in, their presence unannounced but impossible to miss. And all of it was for me. The weight of that realization sat heavy in my chest. I tried to ignore it, to focus on my work, on the patients in front of me, on the immediate needs that did not involve global power plays. But it kept creeping in the smallest moments. The way generators never failed anymore. The way certain medications were always available, no matter how scarce they were elsewhere. The way people started looking at me differently, like they knew something I did not want to admit. "You need to stop," I told him one night. The words came out softer than I intended, but there was no hesitation behind them. "This is not saving me. This is turning me into the reason people die." "You are not the reason," he said. "You are the objective. That is the same thing." "No," he replied, his voice steady, unwavering. The reason is the system that made your survival negotiable. I shook my head, frustration burning through the exhaustion. And your answer is to break it by becoming it? My answer is to remove its control over you. And what about everyone else? I demanded. What happens to them when you are done? For the first time, he did not answer immediately. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, filled only by the distant hum of machinery and the low murmur of voices from inside the clinic. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. They were never part of the equation. The words landed like a blow. Not because they were cruel, but because they were true in a way I did not want to accept. The words landed like a blow. Not because they were cruel, but because they were true in a way I did not want to accept. This was never about fixing the world. It was about bending it just enough, just long enough to change one outcome. Mine. I took a step back, creating distance that felt long overdue. I cannot be part of this. You already are, he said. I cannot be part of this. You already are, he said. Not by choice. Choice is what I am giving you, he replied. The first real one. I let out a hollow breath, my hands curling into fists at my sides. This is not a choice. This is coercion on a global scale. He held my gaze unflinching. No. This is what happens when someone refuses to be bought. The words echoed in my head long after he said them, because I understood what he meant. I had drawn a line, thinking it would protect me, define me, keep me separate from people like him. But all it had done was force him to find another way. A bigger way. A way that did not involve asking. And that was when the fear finally settled in. Not fear of him. Not exactly. Fear of what came next. Because if this was what he was willing to do just to reach the possibility of saving my sight, then there was no telling how far he would go when the final move was within reach. And deep down, I knew the worst part was still coming. By the time everything converged, the war no longer felt like something happening around us. It felt staged, directed, as if every road, every checkpoint, every armed patrol had been quietly repositioned to protect a single outcome: the clinic. I stood inside its main corridor for the first time, my vision catching fragments of light and shadow, the sterile white walls blurring at the edges, and realized this place was nothing like the field stations I had known. It was too clean, too controlled, too insulated from the chaos outside. And that was the problem. Places like this did not exist in war zones unless someone powerful enough decided they should. They were not supposed to let me in, I said, my voice low as I walked past equipment that looked more advanced than anything I had seen even before the explosion. They were not given a choice, Kwon Dae-hyun replied. That answer should not have surprised me anymore, but it still did, because I was starting to understand the scale of what he had done. This was not about rerouting shipments or influencing local conflicts anymore. This was something else entirely. Something higher. The people running this facility were not soldiers or smugglers. They were administrators, directors, decision-makers tied to systems far beyond the battlefield. Systems that did not respond to force. Systems that responded to ownership. I saw it in the way the staff moved around him. Not with fear. Not even with respect. With recognition. Like they had already been informed, already understood that whatever authority they thought they had no longer applied. What did you do? I asked, stopping in the middle of the hallway. He turned slightly, just enough for me to catch the outline of his face. I removed interference. That is not an answer. It is the only one that matters. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady the tension building in my chest. This place is controlled by international contracts, by government oversight, by entities that can be acquired, he interrupted, his tone calm, almost clinical. Or replaced. The words settled heavily between us. Acquired. Replaced. He said them like they were simple business decisions, not the dismantling of an entire system of power. I felt a chill run through me, sharper than anything I had felt on the battlefield. You bought them, I said. I bought the structure that allowed them to decide who receives care, he corrected. That is the same thing. No, he said quietly. It is not. Before I could respond, the doors at the end of the corridor opened, revealing a conference room filled with people who looked like they belonged in boardrooms, not war zones. Men and women in tailored suits, their expressions tight, controlled but not surprised. They were waiting for him. We stepped inside, and the atmosphere shifted immediately. Conversations stopped. Eyes turned. I felt out of place in my worn clothes, the faint smell of antiseptic still clinging to my hands, standing among people who clearly operated in a different world. But none of them looked at me for long. Their focus was on him. This facility operates under international oversight. One of them began, his voice firm but edged with something uncertain. You cannot simply. I already have, Kwon Dae-hyun said. Silence followed. Not shocked silence. Calculating silence. Like they were reassessing the situation in real time, adjusting to a reality they had not anticipated. You do not have the authority, another voice added, sharper this time. He placed a folder on the table, the sound echoing softly in the quiet room. I do not need authority. I have ownership. I watched as one of the directors reached for the documents, flipping through them quickly, his expression shifting with each page. Confusion, then realization, then something close to resignation. This is not possible, he muttered. It is already done, Kwon Dae-hyun replied. The room changed after that. The resistance did not disappear, but it lost its foundation. Because power in places like this did not come from arguments or morality, came from control, and he had taken it. You are destabilizing a critical system, the first man said again, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. There are protocols, prioritization structures. You cannot just remove them. I am not removing them, he said. I am replacing the criteria. And what criteria would that be? Someone else asked. He did not look at them when he answered. He looked at me. No external influence. The simplicity of it hit harder than any grand declaration. No politics. No funding bias. No strategic value calculations. Just a decision made without interference. It sounded almost ideal. Almost fair. But I knew better. Because nothing about how we got here was clean. You manipulated an entire war to do this, I said, my voice cutting through the room. A few heads turned toward me then, their attention shifting for the first time. I could feel their curiosity, their confusion, their attempt to place me within the context of everything that was happening. Yes, he said. No hesitation. No denial. Just truth. And you think that makes this right? I think it makes this possible. The answer settled deep, uncomfortable and undeniable. Because he was not claiming justice. He was claiming outcome. And in his world that was enough. One of the directors leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. So what happens now? He asked. Kwon Dae-hyun's voice was steady when he responded. Now the decision belongs to the medical team. No one else. And the patient? Another asked, glancing briefly in my direction. For the first time since we entered the room there was a shift in him. Not visible to anyone else maybe, but I felt it. A subtle release of something that had been held tight from the beginning. The patient decides if she stays, he said. I felt my breath catch, the weight of everything pressing down all at once. The war, the manipulation, the lives caught in between. And now this, freedom, offered at the end of something that had never been free. No one decides if she sees again, he continued, his voice low but carrying across the room. Not even war. Silence followed, heavier than before, because everyone in that room understood what those words meant. Not just for me, for the system they had just lost control over. And for the first time since all of this began, he stepped back. Not away from the room. From me. The morning of the surgery felt quieter than any battlefield I had ever stood in, and that alone terrified me more than the sound of gunfire ever could. I sat on the edge of the hospital bed, my hands resting against the thin fabric of the gown, feeling every small tremor in my fingers as if my body was trying to warn me that something irreversible was about to happen. The world in front of me was still fractured, shadows bleeding into light, edges refusing to stay sharp, but for the first time, there was a possibility that it might change. Not guaranteed, not promised, just possible. And somehow that uncertainty weighed heavier than blindness ever had. They had explained the procedure twice, then again slower as if repetition could make risk feel safer. partial restoration, neural recalibration, probability not certainty. I listened, nodded, asked the right questions, but none of it stayed with me, because none of it was the real question pressing against my chest. The real question was him. I found him standing outside the operating wing, exactly where I knew he would be. Not inside, not watching, just there, like he had placed himself at the edge of something he refused to cross. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence felt different now. Not tense, not charged, just honest. They said it might work, I said, my voice softer than I expected. They said it might not, he replied. I almost smiled. You do not believe in probability. I believe in outcomes, he said, then paused as if correcting himself. But not this one. That was new. That admission. That lack of control. I studied him through the blur, trying to memorize what I could not fully see. You changed everything, I said quietly. For the possibility of it, he corrected. And the cost. He did not answer right away. For once, there was no immediate calculation, no precise response ready. Just silence. Then finally, the cost was already there. That is not what I asked. I know, he said. The honesty landed heavier than any justification could have, because he was not trying to convince me anymore. He was not trying to frame this as something righteous or necessary. He had done it. That was all. Why? I asked. He looked at me then, not like he was assessing, not like he was deciding, just looking. Because you were the only person who did not want anything from me. A nurse called my name. The moment broke, gently but completely. This is where you tell me to stay, I said, testing him just a little. This is where I do not, he replied. I let out a quiet breath, something between relief and something far more complicated. If it works, if I can see again, you decide what that means, he said. No conditions, no expectations, no claim over what came next. For the first time since I met him, there was nothing in his voice that tried to shape my answer. I removed the war, he added, softer now. The rest is yours. I held his gaze for a second longer, then turned away before I could change my mind. Each step toward the operating room felt heavier than the last, not because I was afraid of losing my sight forever, but because I finally understood what it would mean if I did not. Choice. Real choice. Not bought. Not forced. Not rewritten. Earned. The doors opened and the bright light spilled over me, washing out what little I could still see. I stepped forward, letting it take me, not knowing what I would find on the other side. And for the first time, that uncertainty felt like something I was allowed to own. I do not know yet if I walked out of that room with clear sight or just a different way of seeing the world. But I know this much. Some people fight wars for power. Some people survive them for nothing. And then there are people like him, who break the rules of the world not to own someone but to give them a choice. So let me ask you something. If someone rewrote an entire war just so you could have your life back, would you walk away or would you stay? If this story made you feel something, do not forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one.